Okay, so in this episode, we're talking about the government's role in this industrialization process. And I really want to focus in on three places: the United States, Russia, and Japan. In all three, the government places a significant role in the attempts and either the success of industrialization or its failure. The main goal of this episode is to also really dig into these comparisons. Let's start with the U.S. During the U.S. Civil War, the government's power over the economy grew tremendously. Industries like railroads, like we're seeing here, exploded as they were needed to transport troops and supplies. Tax breaks, land grants, and the protection of corporations helped to stimulate the economy into the boom that would occur after the war was over. Like Great Britain, the U.S. also had massive stores of natural resources and fuels, which you can see in this map, and an enterprising group of businessmen ready to take advantage of the pro-business climate of the government. While this era of robber barons gave rise to massive inequality, the relative belief of Americans in a meritocracy, or the idea that if you work hard and you deserve it, you'll get ahead, and of course in their democracy, really prevented the rise of revolutionary Marxist groups like those we see in Russia and elsewhere in Europe. American journalists and reformers pushed for labor laws that introduced the 8-hour workday and safer working conditions, which limited the appeal of radical movements. Unlike the United States, where most entrepreneurs and even working class individuals believe strongly in the American middle class and one's ability to reach it, no such middle class existed in Russia, which meant that corporations with government support, which had industrialized the US, didn't really exist in Russia. While European powers, especially Britain, had been democratizing and industrializing in the first half of the 19th century, Russia hadn't been, right? Like when we see here, we can see that we just have this very small bourgeoisie and otherwise just, a large mass of serfs. They remained, Russia, entrenched in their absolute monarchy, with the nobles, which are the boyars, and then the rest. After their disastrous loss in the Crimean War, we can kind of see some remnants of that here. So that's the Crimean War in 1854. They're absolutely embarrassed by Britain and France, and they decide, the Russian Tsar decides, because it's an absolute monarch, that some major changes need to be made. One of the changes made following this defeat is the freeing of the serfs in 1861. So here's why freeing the serfs is an important step in modernization. Agricultural labor forced agricultural labor is absolutely incompatible with industrial society. Industrial capitalism requires that a laborer be free to move to where the labor is required by the market or where the wages are the highest in order to stimulate this growth. So if one is just tied to the land, farming for a lord or an enslaver, one cannot become a factory worker. It just doesn't work. So, after the freeing of the serfs, the Russian government, led by the Tsars and his ministers, pursued an aggressive plan to build factories and railroads, especially the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which we can see being built in this image. Once a country has factories, it needs managers, and these managers are inherently middle-class individuals. As Russia's middle class begins to grow, it keeps bumping heads with the Tsarist autocracy, and the fact that they don't have any political voice. If we couple this with the horrible conditions in the factories, the lack of response from the government, and growing tensions between managers and the working class, we can see that Russia is on a crash course for revolution. So let's break it down. We have angry middle class and an angry working class. Our poor Russians have horrible conditions and no real way to request redress or file a grievance. Our middle class Russians are upset because they don't have a political voice and still see Tsarist Russia as behind, backwards, and way too old school. Let's add to this mix a loss in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Oh, that's right. Russia becomes the first European, question mark whether or not they're European, power to lose to a non-European power in a long time. So now our Russians are angry, they're overworked, they have no outlet for their frustrations, and they're crazy embarrassed. And that is how you get the revolution of 1905. Not to be confused with the Revolution of 1917, they're different revolutions. This one, for example, doesn't work. Well, not the way the other one doesn't really work either, but I guess it does depend on how you're keeping track of wins and losses. So in 1905, the Tsar says he's going to improve working conditions. He's going to allow for political groups to be formed, he's going to ease censorship, promise universal education, and sign a constitution, creating a parliament called the Duma, only to promptly ignore the Duma and pretend it then doesn't exist. The next thing you know, it's World War I, which goes horribly for Russia, and we have a serious revolution and a regicide on our hands. Last up to the party is Japan. As you know, Japan had spent most of the Tokugawa shogunate focusing on internal unity and stability and shunning most international interaction. The industrial powers of the world continued to seek new markets, hence their upcoming drive to imperialism, both politically and economically, to power their machine and soak up their excesses. East Asia loomed as a potential rival and as an absolutely massive market of customers. Japan, while its population was minuscule in comparison to China, was nevertheless an attractive prize, and foreign warships and merchant vessels often came close, trying to establish trade ties. They were always rebuffed, though, and so the Western powers grew more interested in Japan, because you always want what you can't have. Japan's relative isolation ended in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry showed up with the U.S. Navy's East India Squadron, called the Black Ships, into Nagasaki Harbor and demanded it opened to U.S. interests, right? We can see some of that going on here. Right, here's one of his ships. We can see flag flying, and we can see some Japanese ships going out to meet it. The Tokugawa shogunate had witnessed with increasing concern the decreasing fortunes of China and especially its increasing interference by Westerners. So they agreed to what was kind of fantastically called the Treaty of Peace and Amity with the United States and similar treaties with several other European countries. In 1858, a new treaty was signed which gave U.S. citizens of Japan what was called extraterritoriality. Which basically means that if you're a U.S. citizen in Japan, you cannot be tried by Japanese courts for breaking their laws. So it gives you a pretty spectacular privilege of just basically doing whatever you want. It also lowered import tariffs from the U.S. to basically nothing and resulted in Japanese farmers being devastated by the import of cheap products from an industrialized United States. Furthermore, the treaty emphasized the export from Japan of silk and tea, meaning that there was little use or as little for use at home, and that more and more farmers shifted their production to those products and not to food products. As you can imagine, the shogunate becomes increasingly blamed for what was seen as embarrassing and damaging policies, which undermined their own power and authority and increased the level of anti-foreign sentiment. Soon, followers of the emperor, remember that the emperor is on top and the shogun is below him, and this emperor himself had publicly condemned this new interaction with foreigners. So those followers began to skirmish with those loyal to the shogun. And throughout the 1860s, low levels of violence and essentially terrorist attacks against the government ripped through Japan. In 1868, the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, here he is, He resigns, and he gives his power over to the young and new emperor Meiji. Let me spell that for you. So this is Yoshinobu, and he resigns by Yoshinobu to the emperor Meiji. And Yoshinobu, though, even though he resigns his position as shogun, he still wants to be a part of the emperor's government. The followers of the emperor don't see this as good enough, and so they seek to destroy Tokugawa power, and they start what's called the Boshin Civil War. You can't see that. The Boshin Civil War. A relatively short-lived and small civil war ensues after this, mostly outside of the Tokugawa family stronghold, and continues until the Tokugawa family and Yoshinobu himself surrender. They are supposed to guarantee Yoshinobu's safety, though. Although sporadic violence continues until 1869, the Emperor Meiji's forces have pretty much consolidated control over Japan and eroded the entire idea of a shogunate. Instead, the Meiji Charter Oath, which is essentially a constitution, is developed with a tripartite separation of powers. In order to ensure that the remnants of pro-shogunate regions don't slink back to their castles and continue planning overthrows, the domains of Japan are reorganized into its current prefectures. Prussian-style forced conscription, so like a standing army, is introduced, and the samurai are turned into imperial bureaucrats. Let's see them. Here they are. Samurai are turned into imperial bureaucrats who are paid a salary rather than the feudal warriors that they had been, which deeply disrupts centuries of samurai culture and, coupled with other reforms, drives the samurai into deep discontent. Other changes include taxes needing to be paid to the landowner in currency rather than the peasants in rice. Swords are not allowed to be worn in public, which is definitely a blow to samurai honor and status. And throughout the 1870s, various samurai revolts take place against these attempts at modernization. In the 1880s, the Emperor Meiji sends advisors on a tour of Europe called the Iwakura Mission. It had been decided that Japan must modernize and industrialize fully in order to avoid becoming a colony of Europe's. Upon their return, a new constitution is created in 1889, declaring the emperor as inviolable and sacred, but granting people the freedoms of speech and religion. At the same time, the government has embraced industry and capitalism, sweeping away the old feudal structures and replacing them with telegraph wires and a modern postal service, complete with stamps and rail wires. So let's go ahead and look. Kind of this is what we're looking at in terms of a modern industrialized Japan. Rail lines are built to connect the country, further unifying it and undermining any attempts at overthrows by the new prefectures. The government supported corporations such as Mitsubishi in their efforts to compete with European and American shipping companies and gave other companies special privileges, right? And here we kind of see the type of government that's set up by and how westernized things have become in Japan. So they base their new Congress, it's called the Diet, the Imperial Diet, and it's based off of Germany's new system. The government set up and organized factories in silk, glass, cement, and brewing, for example, to stimulate, right? And here we can see a factory in Japan. European and American engineers and technicians were integral to this process. The Meiji government sought them out, hired them, paid them generously, and put them where they wanted them to be in order to drive Japan's industrialization. Of course, it wasn't always easy. Many of the factory workers were people who had been farmers on their own land until the arrival of Commodore Perry. There he is. Who would lead to the destruction of Japan's own agricultural industry. Instead, they imported cheap American cotton and used cheap industrial labor to manufacture cloth. The ills that would plague industrial societies elsewhere in the world, long, difficult hours, and not many employment options, existed in Japan as well. But Japan had achieved something pretty spectacular. They had avoided becoming just a market or a colony for Europe. Instead, they started their rise as what historical podcaster Dan Carlin calls the supernova in the East, ready to do what it takes to be accorded the same respect as the Western great powers. And this, while definitely setting Japan up for success, will also put them on a collision course with the West as we near the 20th century and the wars therein.